Hello and welcome back to our last exercise for the ink in water tutorial. In this exercise, we will build upon what we have been creating, and we will create two streams of different colors mixing together. So again, let me show you our second reference. What I really liked about this reference was not only the colors, but how they're mixing together. And this is what we're going to try to achieve. Before we begin, let me show you the final composite. So here you can see we're mixing the two streams of ink, and we also have the foreground bubbles. I believe for this particular exercise, I didn't use the ink bubbles that we used on the first one. One other thing that I decided to change was the background color. I went for a very light background, almost white, which I'm really liking a lot. I'm also using the defocus that I used on the first exercise. So in general, the lighting and the camera was not changed much, only the background. Okay, so let's dive back into Houdini to finish this exercise. So this is the current state of the file that we have. I'm just changing its name as Ink in Water B, just so we know the difference between the two. And the first thing I'm going to do is dive inside the ink geometry. Here I'm reading the cache. One very important thing that I want to remind you is in the end we scaled this down. So the actual emitter was quite big in scale. So let's go back to the initial emitter, was this sphere. I will zoom out. And the first thing that I'm going to do is move the sphere towards the left so we have some space between the two streams of ink before they start mixing. So let's change the center X position to -3 meters. And just as a reminder, let's go through the node graph. Remember, we did convert this sphere to points. We then set the density attribute to 1. After that, we created a velocity attribute, and this is very important for the final result. So remember, we created a visualizer. It's called V. So let's turn on this visualizer, and we will clearly see that the ink will move downward in a vertical motion. So what I want to do first is point this velocity towards the right. And also what I did is I animated the velocity direction in Z. That way the ink streams started separate, and through the animation they came closer and closer together until they started mixing, which I think gave a very nice result. So to have these velocities pointing to the right, make sure to change the default value on X to +2. Now you notice we have an inclination on the velocity. One important pointer here would be that if you're using -5 in Y, if you want perfect 45-degree angle, you could use a value of 5 in +X. So now this would mean that the angle of the velocity is exactly 45 degrees. In this particular case, I don't want that. I will decrease the X velocity. But just for you to know, that may be useful for you later on. So as I mentioned, I need the velocity to point on C, either towards the back or towards the front. So in this case, I will use a -0.65 value just to make the velocity point a little bit towards the back. So let's go ahead and animate this value. I'll go back to frame 1, and I will Alt-click on the velocity Z value to create a keyframe. Then I will move the timeline to the last frame of the animation and change the C value to +0.65. So now if we scrub the timeline, you will see how the velocity is slowly pointing towards the front. Now remember, we have the curl noise. That's fine. We can turn it off if we want to see only the directional velocity. So more or less midway through the animation, the two streams will start mixing. So one other thing we need to take care of is the color. So let's keep going. After the velocity, we added our color. And in the first exercise, we animated this color to go from magenta to cyan. What I'm going to do here is remove these keyframes by Shift, Control, and clicking on the color parameter. Now we can select a very bright color. So I'll go with this 0.5 red. So let's close this window. If we continue down the tree, we created a p-scale attribute. Remember, this attribute is necessary if we want to later rasterize these attributes into a volume. So here we have the volume rasterize attributes, and we're rasterizing density, color, and velocity. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this part of the tree to create a second emitter. And to do that, you can Alt, click and drag all the nodes that are selected. This will create a copy. And before we forget, let's merge these two branches together. So lay down a merge node. Add it here just above the null. And then connect our second emitter into the merge node. So what I'm going to do with this second emitter is, first of all, move it towards the other side. In this case, on positive 3 meters in X. If you want, you can template the original emitter. Then we will create our points from the volume. We will set the density. And here we want to counter animate the velocity. So let's select the point velocity node. And before I forget, I'm going to turn on the curl noise again for both emitters. And in the second emitter, let's change the direction of the C velocity. So go back to frame 1. Change the value from negative to positive 0.65. Now let's go to the last keyframe and change the value to negative 0.65. Okay, so this should take care of the velocity. Now let's take care of the color. So select the color node, and this time we're going to go with the yellow. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have so far. First of all, I'm going to reduce the resolution of the simulation. That way we don't have to wait so much to get our first result. So select your ink sim, and under the Setup tab, look for the voxel size. I'm going to change it to 0.05. Now let's click on the display icon for the ink sim. First of all, make sure you're on frame 1. And let's press play just to have a first look. Okay, so I clearly forgot to change the direction in X for the second emitter. But so far it's looking fine in terms of the color. So let's stop this animation. Let's go back to frame 1. And look for the set V on the second emitter. So let's change the X direction to -3 meters. And again, let's press play.